The bridal apron lay across my knees, stiff with starch, while Micah's mother turned the pages of a narrow brown ledger. Each page made the same dry scratching sound against her thumb. I remember the pin digging into my palm because I was holding it too tightly, though I did not dare set it down. She asked when I had last been ill, how often my body followed its monthly rhythm, and whether I understood what a wife owed a household. Then she folded the apron aside and told me there was one final thing I had to prove before the wedding could continue. I thought she meant my faith. I was wrong. My name is Rebecca, and I left a small Amish settlement near Seneca County, New York, when I was 27. On this channel, I share quiet stories about the rules women were expected to carry without ever naming the weight of them. Subscribe if these confessions feel familiar, or if you believe private pain deserves a place where it can be spoken without ridicule. I also want to ask you one thing. When does a family's concern stop being care and become ownership? Leave your answer below. I read every comment, even the ones written in only a few words. That afternoon in the sewing annex, I did not yet have language for ownership. I only knew Micah's mother had locked her eyes on me and was waiting. I had entered the annex believing we were there to finish my wedding clothes. The room stood behind the meeting house, narrow and bright, with 2 high windows and a long cutting table scarred by years of scissors. Folded linen rested in careful stacks. Straight pins glittered inside a shallow saucer. Micah's mother, Miriam, had invited 3 women to help with the final seams, and their low conversation made the room feel ordinary. Safe, even. I was 21 and eager to please her. Each time she corrected my stitches, I thanked her. I thought patience might become affection if I practiced it long enough. By noon, she sent the others home. The door remained open after they left, but the hallway beyond it was empty. That mattered in our world. A door did not need a lock when obedience stood in its place. Miriam brushed loose thread from the table and carried my blue bridal apron toward me. Beneath it was the brown ledger I had noticed only once before, tucked inside her sewing basket. She placed it between us and opened to a page marked with several women's names. Some were crossed through. Others had small words beside them in pale pencil. Sound. Ready. Doubtful. I asked whether it contained measurements. Miriam answered that it held what a mother needed to know before trusting another woman with her son. At first, her questions sounded almost kind. Had I recovered fully from the fever I suffered 2 winters earlier? Did weakness still come over me during heavy work? Could I carry water without pain in my back? I answered honestly, because honesty had always been described as protection. Then her voice lowered. She asked about my monthly bleeding, whether it arrived on the same day, how long it lasted, and who in my family had struggled to bear children. Heat climbed beneath my collar. Those matters had been shared only with my mother. Miriam already knew the month of my last illness, however, and the number of times my cycle had shifted. Someone had told her. I tried to believe my mother had spoken carelessly, but Miriam corrected that hope. She said Micah had answered what he could, because a husband should not enter marriage blindly. The sentence landed softly. That made it worse. Micah and I had never spoken plainly about my body. Our courtship happened on benches, in wagons, and across crowded rooms where privacy was treated like temptation. Yet he had carried pieces of me into conversations I had never been invited to join. Miriam dipped her pencil and wrote beside my name, I could not read the word from where I sat. When I leaned forward, she covered it with 2 fingers and asked whether I trusted God's order. In our settlement, order was explained as a ladder built by heaven, God above the church above the husband above the wife. Older women rarely stood at the top of anything, but inside a household they could guard the ladder. Miriam spoke of submission as if it were shelter from confusion. She said a bride's body would soon serve purposes larger than comfort or embarrassment. Children strengthened a family. A strong family strengthened the church. Therefore, she said, questions about my health were not truly private. I remember the clock clicking behind her. Each click seemed to remove something from me, though I could not yet say what it was. Then she reached into her basket and placed a folded square of white cloth beside the ledger. She did not describe the test directly at first. She called it confirmation. She said the women before me had understood, including herself. I would provide evidence that my body followed the proper rhythm, then allow her to verify that I had not hidden weakness from the family. Nothing explicit was said. Nothing needed to be. My stomach tightened so sharply that I pressed one hand against it. Miriam watched the movement and mistook fear for proof of illness. She asked me to stand, loosen part of my dress, and follow her instructions without making the matter shameful. I remained seated. The pin in my palm had left a red crescent, and I stared at it, because looking at Miriam felt impossible. I asked where this requirement appeared in the ordnung. Her mouth hardened. She said not every duty needed to be written when faithful women had preserved it for generations. I asked whether the bishop knew. She answered that men did not trouble themselves with women's preparations. That answer opened the first crack in her certainty. Still, I was frightened enough to doubt myself. Perhaps every bride endured this. Perhaps my discomfort proved vanity. Perhaps refusing would injure Micah. Miriam pushed the white cloth nearer and said cooperation would end the unpleasantness quickly. I told her I would answer reasonable questions, but I would not give her what she wanted. My voice did not rise. It almost disappeared. Miriam closed the ledger and wrote one final word before shutting it. Unproven. She said uncertainty could not enter her son's household, and warned that the wedding date might need reconsidering. Then she lifted my unfinished apron, folded it with exact care, and told me to collect my things. Outside, wagon wheels ground over dry gravel. Micah stood beside the hitching rail, holding his hat. He did not ask what had happened. He looked at the ledger beneath his mother's arm, then looked away, and I understood he had been waiting for her verdict. Micah climbed into the wagon without offering me his hand. His mother sat beside him, the ledger resting beneath her shawl, as though it were a Bible. I took the rear bench alone. No one spoke during the first mile. The wheels struck ruts, the harness rings clicked, and every sound seemed louder than breath. At last Micah said his mother had only tried to prevent trouble later. He did not ask whether I felt humiliated. He asked why I had made the matter harder. That question showed me the test had not surprised him. He had expected my obedience, not my fear, and my refusal had embarrassed him more than her demand. During our courtship, Micah had seemed gentle, because he rarely contradicted anyone. I had mistaken quietness for kindness. We met after Sunday singing, worked side by side at apple drying, and sometimes rode with his younger sister between us. He never pressed against the rules. That made him appear safe. Yet his mother was always nearby, measuring me through ordinary questions. Could I knead enough dough for a large family? Did headaches prevent me from finishing chores? Had my mother recovered quickly after childbirth? I thought she was learning how to welcome me. Now each question returned with a different shape. She had not been welcoming me. She had been gathering evidence. The wedding date had also carried conditions I had failed to recognize. Miriam often said November would suit us if my strength remained steady. Once, after I missed a quilting because of cramps, she suggested spring might be wiser. Micah laughed then and said mother's worried. I laughed with him. I did not understand that my body was being placed against a calendar I had never seen. When I asked whether marriage would give us more privacy, Micah spoke about unity, not boundaries. A wife should have nothing to hide from her husband, he said. He never explained whether a husband should protect anything from his mother. I had not known enough to ask. My monthly cycle had never been perfectly regular. A winter fever when I was 19 disrupted it for several months, and hard weeks sometimes changed the timing again. My mother called it something women quietly endured. Miriam treated it as a warning about my moral and physical fitness. By the time we reached my parents' farm, she had transformed uncertainty into suspicion. She told my mother the family could not ignore signs placed before them. My mother's face went pale, but she did not defend me. She asked what I had refused, not what had been demanded. That difference settled heavily inside me, because it showed how quickly shame could move from one woman's hands into another's. Micah returned 2 evenings later and asked to speak beside the woodshed. He kept his eyes on a split log, while admitting he had given Miriam the dates I mentioned feeling unwell. He had also told her about the fever, my missed church Sundays, and my worry that I might not bear children easily. I had shared that fear during one rare conversation when we stood far from everyone else. I believed it had belonged to us. Micah said marriage required openness, and that his mother understood women's matters better than he did. Every woman in his family had cooperated, he added. He spoke as though repetition turned intrusion into wisdom. I asked whether any had been allowed to refuse. He did not answer. Instead, he handed me a folded paper bearing Miriam's careful writing. It was called a household understanding. The language sounded mild: mutual respect, family cooperation, guidance from experienced women. Beneath those phrases were promises that changed everything. I would report illnesses affecting my duties. Miriam could advise on spacing children, household work, and recovery after birth. If concerns arose, private matters could be discussed with her before anyone approached church leaders. The paper did not prepare me to become Micah's wife. It placed me under continuing inspection. He said signing it would prove goodwill and allow the wedding preparations to resume. My name waited at the bottom beside an empty line. For one trembling moment, I considered signing. The dress was nearly finished. Invitations had traveled through family conversations. My father had already promised 2 calves for the wedding meal, and my younger sisters spoke of the day as though it belonged partly to them. Refusal would disappoint everyone at once. That was the power of the paper. It turned my boundary into a public injury. Micah softened his voice and said, "No one wished to control me. They only needed reassurance that I would accept help." I asked why help required a signature. He said trust had been damaged. I looked at the blank line and realized they believed my refusal, not their secrecy, had caused the damage. I folded the paper along its existing crease and returned it unsigned. Then I told Micah something I had not understood inside the sewing annex. I had not failed Miriam's test because my body was uncertain. I had failed because I would not surrender the right to decide who could question, examine, or record it. Micah's expression changed from concern to disappointment. He said pride could destroy a household before it began. I asked whether a household built on inspection was already damaged. He left without answering, carrying the paper against his chest. The next morning, my mother removed the wedding fabric from the sitting room, and by afternoon, the settlement knew our November date was no longer certain. By Sunday, the postponement had become a story other people told for us. No announcement was made, yet women stopped asking about the wedding meal, and men who once nodded warmly at Micah now watched me as though I carried a hidden defect. My mother said little, but she folded the blue apron into a chest beneath winter blankets. That hurt more than open anger. It meant she had begun preparing for shame. At meeting, Miriam sat 3 benches ahead and never turned around. Afterward, a cousin asked whether I had been unwell again. Her voice was gentle, but the question was not innocent. Someone had already changed my refusal into a weakness of the body. Micah came the following evening with a proposal he called merciful. If I apologized to his mother, signed the household understanding, and agreed to complete the examination privately, the November wedding might still be saved. He spoke without cruelty. That was what made the pressure difficult to name. He believed he was offering peace. I asked what part of the apology belonged to me. He said I had embarrassed his mother and cast doubt on her intentions. When I told him intention did not erase harm, he looked genuinely troubled, as though I had introduced a language he had never been taught. Then he said a wife who began marriage by resisting guidance would bring sorrow into both families. 2 days later, my parents arranged a visit with Deacon Reuben and his wife Salome. The meeting took place in our front room, where the ticking wall clock usually made winter evenings feel calm. That night it sounded like a warning. Reuben asked whether pride had prevented me from accepting women's counsel. I described the ledger, the questions, and the folded cloth. He listened, then said female preparations were generally handled outside men's knowledge. Salome suggested I confess any bitterness before it hardened. Neither asked Miriam to explain the rule. I was expected to repent for my reaction, while the demand itself remained protected by silence. The shape of the trap became clearer. Miriam finally spoke to me alone after the meeting. She stood beside the wash line, snapping wooden pegs into a small basket. Her voice had lost its usual firmness. She told me that before her own wedding, Micah's grandmother had asked the same questions and required the same proof. Miriam had wept, but she had obeyed. She said obedience spared her family scandal and taught her that marriage demanded sacrifice before comfort. For one moment, I saw not an enemy, but a frightened young woman hidden inside an older one. Then she said suffering had strengthened her. The softness closed. Because she had survived the ritual, she believed continuing it made the ritual righteous. Her explanation unsettled me more than anger would have. If she admitted the test was wrong, then she would have to face what had been done to her. She would have to name her own mother-in-law's authority as harm, and perhaps question every time she had defended it afterward. It was easier to call the ritual protection, easier to make another bride kneel beneath the same weight. I began to understand how women could guard systems that wounded them. They were not always given power to change the rules, so some claimed power by enforcing them. That understanding gave Miriam depth, but it did not give her the right to continue. The first person to bring me proof was Micah's younger sister, Eliza. She arrived near dusk, carrying a basket of mending, and asked to speak in the spring house, where the water covered our voices. From beneath the cloth, she drew 3 copied pages in faint pencil. They came from Miriam's ledger. The names reached back through years of marriages in their family. Beside them were judgments: obedient, uncertain, difficult, weak-minded. One woman had been marked unsuitable, yet Eliza knew she later bore 6 healthy children in another district. Another had been called doubtful, after refusing questions about her mother's miscarriages. The ledger was not medical wisdom. It was a record of compliance. I searched the copied pages for scripture references, church decisions, or even the name of a bishop who had approved the practice. There were none. Eliza said Miriam kept the book with household accounts, not church records. The test belonged to their family, perhaps to a few connected women, but it had been spoken with the weight of divine order. That was the deepest deception. No one needed to invent a verse. They only needed to lower their voices and say faithful women had always done it. Tradition filled the empty space where authority should have been. My supposed failure had never measured health, faith, or readiness for marriage. It measured whether fear could make me cooperate. The next morning, I asked for a final family council before anyone canceled the wedding in my name. I did not ask because I still expected Micah to rescue me. Something had shifted beyond that hope. I wanted the rule spoken aloud in a room where it could no longer hide behind women's work and private preparation. My father hesitated, worried that public questions would deepen the shame. I told him the shame had already grown because secrecy fed it. Eliza gave me the copied pages, though her hands shook when she did. I placed them inside my Bible and sent word to Miriam, Micah, and the deacon. This time, the ledger would not speak for me. Part 4. What my failure finally proved. The council gathered in my parents' front room after evening chores. Deacon Reuben sat near the stove, Micah beside him, and Miriam across from me, with the brown ledger closed on her lap. Eliza stood near the doorway, pale but steady. I placed the copied pages on the table and asked one question: who had given this test the authority of church law? No one answered. The clock ticked. A coal shifted inside the stove. Miriam finally said, women's customs did not require men's approval. I asked why. Then, refusal had been treated as spiritual rebellion. The silence that followed was the first honest answer I received. Miriam opened the ledger and accused Eliza of stealing private family records. She said my questions proved I lacked humility, and warned that marriage could not survive a wife who placed personal comfort above inherited wisdom. I did not argue about comfort. I asked whether she would permit another woman to record Eliza's cycles, illnesses, and fears before deciding whether she deserved marriage. Miriam's fingers tightened around the cover. She said that would be different. Everyone in the room heard the weakness in those words. For years, the ritual had remained powerful because each bride faced it alone. Spoken plainly, before witnesses, it no longer sounded sacred. It sounded like control wearing borrowed language. I turned to Micah and asked whether our marriage would include any boundary his mother could not cross. He looked toward Miriam before answering. That small movement decided more than his words. He said a husband must honor his parents and protect unity between families. I asked whether protecting unity meant allowing private information to pass between them without my consent. His face reddened. He said he could not promise to keep secrets that might affect the household. He still did not understand that privacy was not deception. I realized then that even if the wedding continued, the sewing room door would follow me into every room of our home. Miriam would not need to enter. Micah would carry her authority inside. Deacon Reuben suggested we pause and pray before making a final decision. For most of my life, prayer had been used to slow anger and restore obedience. That night, waiting felt like another way of allowing others to decide for me. I closed my Bible and said the wedding would not take place. My father inhaled sharply. My mother covered her mouth. Micah stared as though I had overturned something permanent. Perhaps I had. I told him I did not believe he was cruel, but kindness without courage could not protect a marriage. He had been trained to preserve order, even when order required my surrender. I would not enter a household where love depended on inspection. The consequences arrived quietly. Families who once invited me to sewing circles stopped sending word. At market, conversations shortened when I approached. Some believed I had hidden an illness. Others said I had rejected marriage because worldly pride had entered me. My mother grieved the lost wedding more openly than she grieved what caused it. For months, the blue apron remained beneath winter blankets. I stayed in the settlement longer than people later assumed, working, praying, and wondering whether I had mistaken stubbornness for conscience. Freedom did not arrive as a bright doorway. It came as doubt, loneliness, and the slow realization that returning would require me to betray myself knowingly. When I eventually left Seneca County, a physician examined the concerns Miriam had treated as evidence against me. She explained that irregular cycles could have many causes and could not predict my worth, character, or future as a mother. She offered no dramatic guarantee. She simply gave uncertainty its proper size. Hearing that should have brought relief, but my hands still trembled when she opened her notebook. For years, questions about my body made me feel as though a verdict was being prepared. Healing began when I learned that informed care asks permission, explains its purpose, and accepts refusal. The difference was not merely medical. It changed how I understood every authority I had once feared. Several years later, Eliza sent me a letter. A young woman engaged to one of their cousins had been invited to the same sewing annex. Miriam had brought out the ledger, but this time, the bride already knew what it contained. Eliza had warned her. The young woman declined the questions and left before anyone could pronounce her unsuitable. The wedding continued after her family demanded a clear church ruling, which no one could produce. Miriam did not abandon the belief immediately. People rarely release a system that has helped them explain their own pain. But the ledger stopped deciding weddings. Once secrecy broke, tradition had to defend itself, and it had never learned how. For a long time, I believed the word unproven described a deficiency in me. Now I understand it described the limit of their power. They could not prove I would obey without consent. They could not prove shame would keep me silent. They could not prove marriage mattered more to me than the right to remain a person inside it. Perhaps someone